O God, our Father, it is in showing mercy and in forgiving that you most especially show your almighty power. Forgive our sins and continue to fill us with the gifts of your love. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. You might have noticed that we take the prayer of the morning liturgy, the liturgy that is meant to give the theme to the day. Today, the forgiveness of sin. We will dedicate tomorrow, the second day of our retreat, to Don Bosco. Even though he comes through often, constantly in our conferences and even in our homilies, let's invite our beloved founder to join us tomorrow, beginning with the Eucharistic Assembly, at which time his votive Mass will be offered. We need to feel his presence in our midst. He is, after all, the man who inspired our vocation and who literally led us to Christ. We will also ask him to pray with us and for us. He knows what to ask of God for us, his sons, but we must ask him to do it for us. A little change in the schedule of today. We should be having an open forum tonight after evening prayers. A forum on some of the things we speak about in the conferences. But we'll postpone it to Friday night. It makes sense to do so, since much more remains to be said in these conferences. So please make a note of anything that you might wish to bring up or even to contest at that forum Friday night. I can tell you that last week's open forum turned out to be a rather exciting session. And tonight, those of you who have not yet seen Silent Witness, the splendid documentary on the Shroud, are in for a treat. So please don't miss it. And to come for what is an update on the latest developments on the Shroud. I heard some beautiful voices, singing voices among you. Let's put them to the best of use during these days of the retreat. I only wish I could sing, but my musical or singing career came to an early and inglorious end about 2 months later after I got to the oratory. Would you believe it? That wonderful coadjutor, famed maestro, Giuseppe Doliani, who for decades was the soul of all that was music at Baldocco, would have us boys lined up and then ask us with the notes in front of us to sing the solfeggio, which meant to read the notes and to sing them at the same time. And he would walk between the lines to find out the flats, the ones that didn't come out in tune. One day he stopped by me and he looked at me and he said, "But you are not singing the notes." I said, "Maestro, I am singing the notes." And he said to me, "You are not singing the notes, you are singing between the notes." And so he said, "Okay, you may go and join the Altar Boy Society," which I was very happy to do. But honestly, was it St. Augustine who said, how do you put it? Amantis est cantare. The person who loves sings. And this should be what we do when, with the blessed Lord, we meet to tell him we love him. When I first arrived at Valdocco as a youngster, I was not particularly impressed that Don Bosco should be talked about by nearly everyone. After all, a great many of the Salesians living then at the oratory had known Don Bosco. But what impressed me was that so many people should talk about a certain Don Pavia, who I soon came to know had been in charge of the local festive oratory for almost 40 years. On one of my first Sundays there, we students were herded for a special ceremony on the grounds of the festive oratory, which is adjoining the mother house, as you know. It was, as we were told, the 10th anniversary of the death of Don Pavia, and a bust or a statue of him was to be unveiled, inaugurated. Never before in my life had I seen such an outburst of enthusiasm among the hundreds of people, most of whom were youngsters, when the statue was unveiled and the band struck up a joyful march. It seemed to me it was like as if Don Pavia had come back to life and appeared in person. Who was Don Pavia? Appointed by Don Bosco himself as director of the first festive oratory, youth center, right there at Valdocco, Don Pavia became a living legend in the Valdocco section of Turin. You might note that the festive oratory was not in those days what it is now. There was still little enough at the time about which I speak. A large playground, what you might call a multi-purpose building, hall with a stage, and 2 or 3 sheds. The question was, what could possibly attract 700 to 800 youngsters from the nearby tenements? 2 men, Don Pavia and his valiant assistant, coadjutor Giovanni Garbellone. The 2 were a perfect team. Garbellone was 6.5 feet tall, with the bearing of a carabiniere and the voice of a Caruso, took care mostly to keep a semblance of discipline among those unruly youngsters, while Don Pavia tended to their souls. But occasionally Garbellone stepped in to give Don Pavia a hand, and would you believe it, even as confessor. In spite of the fact that Saturday was the appointed day for confessions, a great many boys tended to crowd around Don Pavia's confession on Sunday morning, and this would delay the Mass. Garbellone found a solution. He would sit on a chair in back of the chapel and signal to the young ones around Don Bosco's confessional to come to him. They did, of course. A dialogue would start between Garbellone and the penitent. Tell me, what did you do? I kicked my sister. Anything else? No. Promise not to do it again. Say a Hail Mary and go to communion. And he would even give the boy a parting blessing. On rare occasions, if the sin warranted, he would send the penitent to Don Pavia in the confessional. In 10 minutes, he could take care of at least 40 or 50 boys. unbelievable, the simplicity, the zeal with which these older Salesians worked. And sometimes you wonder at the strange things they did. The work of those two men was not confined to the halls and playground of the festive oratory. Dom Pavia was a familiar sight in the nearby ramshackle tenements where most of the boys came from. You know, Valdogo kept for a long time that particular tone of being way under the middle class in Turin. It is only since the Second World War, no, let's say, yes, just about, that things changed entirely, and now you would hardly recognize the place. First of all, the boys are diminished, and you barely see any of them. I noticed the oratory, the festive oratory, is also a mixture now of boys and girls, which is fine. It is more like the typical parish center. Beautiful buildings, a lot of beautiful flowers, but mighty few youngsters. This is the impression one gets now, but that's the way it is. Now, Dom Pavia was actually a man who was known, I think he was known even better than the pastor, because he was everywhere. He would be seen carrying on his shoulders bags of coal and potatoes, which he went to beg, and always ready to solve any problem. He would go up those incredible flights of steps with these heavy things on his shoulder. It was a sight that people had gotten used to, and for which they loved this man. But came a sad day when Dom Pavia, old and sickly, felt he could carry on no longer. Giovanni, he told his faithful co-worker, coadjutor Garbellone, I am at the end of the road. I have asked Donaldo, who was then rector major, to let me go to Valsalice. I can work at the festive oratory there. The boys are fewer, and they are also easier to handle. Garbellone almost passed out. So you are leaving this place, Dom Pavia, he said. You are leaving me. You are leaving these smelly kids so you can go to aristocratic Valsalice where all the kids are signorini and smell good. Well, go if you want. But let me tell you something. And he solemnly pointed to the crucifix on the wall. He will not like it a bit, not one bit. Anyway, he said, who tells you that I and the boys are going to let you go? By now, they were both in tears. You are so right, Giovanni, Dom Pavia replied. I have no business to leave this place. Even Don Bosco told me that I would end my days here. I'll stay until they'll carry me out in a casket. And so it was. He remained at his post for 2 or 3 more years, when, just as he said, he left his beloved festive oratory in the casket. The Oratory Chronicle registers the fact that the crowds at the funeral of Dom Pavia reminded everyone of the crowds that attended the funerals of Don Bosco and of Don Rua. How many Dom Pavias and Garbellones in the society during the last 100 years? Men who have touched and changed the life of countless youngsters. How many are doing just that at this very moment? Now these are the men whom, to use the words of Pope John Paul, whom the world needs desperately. Men who cast their lot so completely with Christ as to reflect him in everything. In everything he was and did, following in its footsteps on the way of humility and poverty and obedience and suffering, giving all of themselves to others just as Christ himself did. As Salesians, this is exactly what we are called to do. This is what our Salesian vocation is all about. I am sure that by now you have noted that theorizing is given very little play in these conversations. Let me tell you why. First of all, I am convinced a retreat should aim primarily to move the heart and fill it with God's grace and love, and also with eagerness to move on the path to which we have been called, with joy and enthusiasm. Secondly, we now have available a goodly supply of literature, even in English, that does an excellent job at analyzing the theory behind Don Bosco's words and practice. Incidentally, you might know that the great theorist of the Salesian way of life is presently Father Joseph Aubry, a man with a keen insight and a commanding knowledge of Don Bosco and of the Salesian tradition. His two most recent volumes, The Renewal of Our Salesian Life, should be translated without delay. Thirdly, if I may say it, I think of my own vocation, how it came about, and how it was strengthened in the early years. And what do I find? No sermonizing, no theorizing, but the inspiring living example of men who personify the best of Don Bosco and the Salesian way. And this is why I give you only the barest bones of theory. Let the example of outstanding confreres inspire us to love our Salesian vocation. It is God's greatest gift to us after our baptism. On the subject of the Salesian vocation, here is a simple enough question. Why did I become a Salesian? There are four possible answers. One, to save my soul. But this answer is too restrictive. All Christians must cooperate with God's grace to save their souls, to attain the goal for which we have been created, eternal life with God. Two, to avoid the entanglements with the world and all its dangers. But again, it is what all Christians must do. And St. Paul constantly reminds simple Christians that this is part of their Christian living. Three, to help others, especially the young and the poor, to discover Christ and find in him redemption and liberation. But we said it this morning, I do not have to vow myself to poverty, chastity, and obedience, and live in the community in order to do that. Fourth, quite simply, I became a Salesian because through Don Bosco, Jesus said to me, come, follow me. Give up everything. Deny yourself. Take up your cross. Walk with me the way of poverty, humility, and obedience, ready to serve my and your brothers, usque ad sanguinem effusionem, if it be even to the giving of your life for them. In other words, Jesus said to me, be another me in the world around you. This is it. This is why you and I became Salesians. Richard Pittini was one of the great Salesians it was my privilege to know and to love. Provincial of our New Rochelle province from 1927 until 1933. He later became, as you know, Archbishop of Santo Domingo, achieving such a transformation in the church of that republic that the then apostolic nuncio of the republic, future Cardinal Fietta, told me years later, in 25 years, Archbishop Pittini did more for that struggling republic than had been done since Christopher Columbus made it his favorite residence on the new continent. And the Cardinal continued, I do not know why I became a Cardinal, but I know there were 100 reasons why Pittini should have been one. He had the makings of a pope. For some 2 months after Father Binelli died in 1931, Father Pittini, then our provincial, took over the 2 weekly conferences at the novitiate in Newton, where I was then assistant. That's where we should have had tape recorders. The man, a fascinating speaker, let his Salesian heart talk. The novices took notes. Father Binelli always encouraged us to take note. And the novices did take notes, and I took some too. The series of talks he gave might be given this title, Why I Became a Salesian. But before we come to his words, the story of why and how he became a Salesian simply must be told. He was one of 3 children of a widowed mother when at 16 he decided to go to the diocesan seminary of the Treviso diocese in the north of Italy, some 80 miles from his native village. He first became aware of Don Bosco through the Salesian Bulletin, which the seminarians always read with relish. But let's hear him tell the story. I was at the seminary some 3 months, very homesick, and with a growing interest in Don Bosco and in the exploits of his missionaries in Latin America. Visits from our families were restricted to 4 times a year, and I was dying to see my mother, brother, and sister. When on the first visiting Sunday I was called out of study hall, my heart was pounding with joy. In the parlor, my brother and sister came forward to embrace me. Where is mother? I asked. They both burst into tears. Did they not tell you? My brother asked. Oh, Richard, mother died last Tuesday, quite suddenly. We had her funeral the day before yesterday. I was stunned, and for a moment I thought I would die too. My brother continued, the pastor assured us he sent a telegram to the rector immediately. We wondered why we never did hear anything from you. Later in the day, the rector admitted, with apologies, that incredibly, whoever had been charged to tell me had forgotten to do so. I was so upset, I left that very day for home with my brother and sister. I remember that during the trip home, all I thought was of my mother, until suddenly Don Bosco came to my mind. That's where I'll go, to Turin. I'll become a Salesian. Don Bosco had died some 3 years before. I spent 4 months at Valsarice, where his grave was, before being admitted to the novitiate. What an unbelievable change from the cold, formal atmosphere of the diocesan seminary to the joy-filled climate of Valsarice. I remember praying, "Oh Lord, if my mother's death was the price I had to pay for my Salesian vocation, I will never again complain that you took her from me." Why did Richard Pittini become a Salesian? Here is where my notes come in handy. He says, "Even while I was at the seminary, the more I read the life of Don Bosco, the more I wanted to be like he was. What the Salesians were doing, their work for youth, in the mission lands especially, set me dreaming. However, in the novitiate, under the inspiring guidance of Don Barberis, I began to understand that I could not be like Don Bosco. I could never be a Salesian unless I first became a good religious. It was again Don Barberis who made me understand what being a good religious meant. It meant I was to be ready to leave everything for the sake of Jesus in order to follow him, which is exactly what we do when we make the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience." Remember, he was talking to novices. He continues, "I recall that to underline the importance of our total consecration to God, Don Barberis made us memorize the words Don Bosco spoke to the first Salesians who on May 14th, 1862, made their vows to him. He said, Don Bosco, he said to them after the profession, "While you were making your vows to me, I was myself making them to the crucified Lord, offering myself completely as a living sacrifice to him, ready to do anything and everything to promote God's glory and the good of souls, of the young particularly." And Don Pittini continued, "It is in this consecration to the Lord that we find the explanation of Don Bosco's holiness and of the immense success of his apostolate. Our Salesian vocation likewise must be rooted in this total consecration to the Lord if it is to make other Don Boscos of us." How is a Salesian to live his total consecration to God? Asks Father Pittini at this point, and he replies, "Certainly not as a Jesuit or a Passionist or a Redemptorist. Here is where we must study Don Bosco, his life, his spirit and methods. We will find that his consecration to God was made with a view to bring the redeeming and saving gifts of Christ to the young and the poor. We will find, too, that he approached this task with love, joy, optimism, enthusiasm. In other words, in the Salesian way. I wish I could tell you how pleased I was when I recently read in Father Aubry's latest book, which I just mentioned, The Renewal of Our Salesian Life, the chapter titled Consecration and Salesian Spirituality. It is amazing how, with his penetrating analysis, Father Aubry comes to the very same conclusion Father Pittini came to 50 and more years ago. Only it takes Father Aubry some 58 pages to do it, but in a beautiful way, in a marvelously perceptive and intelligent way. That a religious must be totally Christ-centered seems obvious enough. Is it always actually so? Now listen, 80% of the defections from the religious life in recent years are due to a lack of solid spiritual formation in the individual involved. It is the sad but not surprising conclusion reached by a survey of nearly 2,000 religious communities in Europe. Our own Father Vigano places the failure to grow spiritually as the principal cause of the defections in our society. This seems to justify Father Pittini's oft-repeated statement that our Salesian vocation becomes viable only if we are totally centered on Christ, which is what our religious consecration is actually meant to achieve for us. What does this consecration, so crucial to our Salesian life, actually involve? Even to the point of repeating myself until you hate me for it, it involves renouncing self and the world so that we can put on Christ and grow in Him until He becomes actually our life. The words of St. Paul again, to me, to live is Christ. I might just add that this growing in Christ, this ascesis, this ascending upward, involves a lifetime process which our profession only began. If we stop working at it at any stage of our life, we run into trouble and actually risk disaster. We become stunted spiritually, frustrated, no longer even able to find a meaning in our life as Salesians. Forgive me if after talking so much about Archbishop Pittini, I dare add one or two anecdotes about this extraordinary Salesian. Incidentally, the Archbishop of Santo Domingo, who is a cardinal, has actually mentioned the possibility of introducing the cause of beatification of Archbishop Pittini. When after his first 5 years as Archbishop of Santo Domingo, he went to Rome for his ad limina visit to give, as required, a complete account of his archdiocese, he was invited to sit in with the commission of prelates who had examined the report. Your Excellency, the presiding Monsignor said, we are amazed at all you were able to accomplish in 5 years, and too at the plans you have for the next 5 years. We congratulate you. One thing we would point out, not so much in criticism, but simply as something you might keep in mind. We notice from your report that you rely a great deal, not to say almost exclusively, on the Salesians for your work of expansion. Masterful was Archbishop Pittini's reply. I owe it to my confreres, he said, for whatever has been done so far. 5 Salesians will soon staff the new diocesan seminary, which, as you know, has not had a single vocation in the past 78 years. In any case, I could hardly take your comments, he told us, Monsignore, as a criticism. It is, if anything, the greatest compliment and the most welcome praise you could bestow on me. Now, more than ever, I am convinced that Don Bosco's way works also in Santo Domingo. In the early 60s, visiting one day at the New York Chancery office on pastoral business, I was speaking with the Vicar General, Monsignor Joseph Murphy, who out of a clear sky asked me if Archbishop Pittini, who had died shortly before at Santo Domingo, was the same Pittini who had been a Salesian provincial at New Rochelle. Oh yes, Monsignor, I replied, and I knew him quite well. Let me tell you something, he said. In the fall of 1928, I was a college student at Dunwoody Seminary when the rector announced to both the college and the theology students that the Salesian Provincial would come to address the student body on Don Bosco, whose beatification had been programmed for the following June, 1929. We were easily 200 in the assembly hall, with several members of the faculty present, when the smiling, tall, thin priest was introduced by our rector. In fairly fluent English, with a pleasant foreign accent, and an occasional problem with some words, Father Pittini greeted us and then said, "Your rector told me I could speak to you for 45 minutes. Here is what I will do. I will speak for a half hour, after which, if you shuffle your feet," Monsignor said to me, I remember, he mispronounced the word shuffle. "If you shuffle your feet," he said, "I'll stop. I'll thank you and I'll go my way. If you don't shuffle your feet, I will continue to speak for 15 more minutes." We were mesmerized by the man. He was an orator, a storyteller, and an actor, all in one. After what seemed a few short minutes to us, he stopped. He turned to look at the large clock on the wall facing the assembly and said, "More than a half hour has passed, and you did not shuffle your feet. Does this mean I can go on?" A mighty applause greeted his words with shouts of "Yes, yes." His talk lasted for more than an hour and a half, the Monsignor concluded, but we could have listened to him forever. Father Pittini went all over the country with his famous talks on Don Bosco, and specifically to seminaries. He used to say, if priests come to know Don Bosco, they will eventually send us vocations. But occasionally he would pluck some of those future priests right from the seminary too. When in October 1929, a great service was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral in honor of the newly beatified Don Bosco, the great church was filled to capacity with some 20 bishops in the sanctuary. Do you realize that nobody up to the time Archbishop Pittini came to the States, maybe I'm exaggerating, nobody, but Don Bosco's name and the Salesian name were unknown in the United States. And when the new Don Bosco Seminary, which was inaugurated in Newton in 1931, was opened, close to 50 aspirants were ready to enter it. Unbelievable. Now we could ask, what has happened to our enthusiasm for Don Bosco? Are we not acting like a tired, frustrated bunch of people who have lost our hearts? Like Father Pittini, we should be radiating Christ, actually, and Don Bosco too. But that will never be unless these hearts of ours are first filled with Christ, and two, filled with the ideals of Don Bosco. I have a cruel question for you. Are truly our hearts filled with the ideals of Don Bosco? Here is a test. How many of us are willing to take the initiative of seriously interesting one boy or a young man in our life? How many have done so recently? How many among us would jump to the opportunity of addressing an audience on Don Bosco, even on short notice? And even more important, how do we rate Don Bosco as a personal model of our spiritual life and of our pastoral and educative work? Is it possible we may have formed the notion that he belongs to another era, that he speaks a different language, and anyway, anything he might say to us cannot be that relevant to our times? And so as we conclude, a little self-examination is in order. We may well find reasons for some regret and a little humiliation too. How well do we know our founder? Father Williams told us, or at least he left it written in the report, that Don Bosco is the great unknown in our province, or if known, known only superficially. What do we really know about his charisma, his educational system, his genial approach to evangelization? We may have to admit that we know even less about his prayer life, the spirit of union with God, which was so evident in him. And yet, the Church has as much as told us, and Pope Pius XI, who spoke so openly and freely and enthusiastically about Don Bosco, whom he canonized, mentioned this very often, that if any modern saint ever identified with Christ, that saint is Don Bosco. A passionate love for souls, an abiding desire to spend and be spent for them, gentleness of heart, detachment from earthly things, poverty, suffering, humiliation, if they but had to bring souls to God. All these things Don Bosco shared with Jesus. Where do we stand with regard to these very things? Perhaps I should not be throwing these questions at you, good and faithful Salesians that you are, but let's think about them anyway.